Here's a photograph of one of the world's most luxurious ships, burnt, flipped over, and temporarily abandoned in New York Harbor. Before this unfortunate incident, this was the ultimate ship, a title that has applied to many vessels before her. And perhaps in line with tradition, none of them have maintained the title for long. Such was the case with the SS Normandie, a French transatlantic ocean liner, state-of-the-art for the 1930s, dubbed the Ship of Light. However, the Ship of Light was snuffed out in the flames of World War II at the hands of one of France's allies. So stay tuned to find out why, as today we discover the rise and fall of SS Normandie. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. In the 1920s, the United States put restrictions on immigration into the nation, which was a major change as there had always been a steady stream of immigrants arriving in America from Europe. The travel industry that had developed in the Old World had shifted into a new phase. Instead of immigration from Europe, the focus became tourism to and from the United States. The desire to leave America and visit other countries was particularly strong for many upper-class tourists due to prohibition, the ban on alcohol that lasted into the 1930s. Several companies stepped up to meet the demand with their supply, and the ships built to do the job were called ocean liners, as opposed to the modern-day cruise ships. Unlike today's cruise liners, which are dedicated solely to transportation, ocean liners were multi-purpose, intended for the transportation not only of people, but mail and cargo. Not to mention the various other roles that they could fulfill, such as floating hospitals, troop carriers, and, in some rare situations, combat boats, fitted with cannons and all the rest of it. The most famous, or perhaps infamous, ocean liner was the RMS Titanic, whose sinking in 1912 remains one of the worst maritime disasters in history and forced a worldwide reanalysis of safety measures. As the Titanic was also considered an ultimate unsinkable ship, the echoes of that tragedy were still quite loud a decade later. Around this time, British companies such as Cunard and the White Star Line, the shipping line behind the Titanic, were planning their own modernized cruise liners to compete with the record-breaking German models that had come to prominence, such as the Bremen and Europa. The spotlight was indisputably on these two nations, apparently taking their naval arms race from before the First World War into a new interwar period where civilian liners became the focus. And it's here that French transatlantic shipping company CGT enters in the 1920s with its flagship, Ile-de-France, named for the area inland and around Paris. This was a modern and beautiful ship built in the Art Deco style of the time. She was a mark of pride for both the company and the nation as a whole, which was also competing with the two naval giants that we mentioned earlier. However, she was not as grand as she could have been. You see, the hull was smaller and slower than many cutting-edge ships at the time, but being designed with truly modern interior art was enough to keep her as the pride of CGT. They planned on continuing to follow these designs if it were not for the arrival of a new voice that would change everything. Vladimir Yorkovich, a 42-year-old Russian man, had read about the success of the Ile-de-France in the newspaper. During his time in Russia, he was a naval engineer in St. Petersburg, designing 11 submarines in the 1910s before fleeing Russia in 1917 in the wake of the revolution. He brought with him designs from 1912 for a class of super dreadnoughts, the biggest, strongest, and fastest battle cruisers ever put to paper at the time. When he brought these designs to the British, they turned him away for being deemed to be radically different from their norms. So he brought the design for this Borodino-class vessel to CGT, and they gave him a job on the spot. Like Britain, France was utterly convinced of the superiority of their ship design to the point of arrogance. But that came crashing down as the German liners launched, shattering records. But as the old guard of ship designers moved on or passed away, this new design included features that French naval engineers had never seen before. One of these design features was a whaleback, as they called it. The whaleback was a shell covering the front of the deck, concealing the deck machinery such as winches, ropes, and chains, and keeping them safe and secure under a smooth surface. The smokestacks were also unique, ovular as opposed to the traditional circular-shaped funnels angled at 10 degrees for aerodynamics, letting it be faster than previous designs. It only needed 2 of the 3 funnels it had, with the rearmost standing for pressure balance, as well as rounding out the silhouette for a better aesthetic design. The stern, or back of the ship, also had its unique design. The typical trend of the day was to join the rudder with the stock below the waterline, forcing it to be dry docked if it needed to be repaired, which consumed a lot of resource. The stern of the Normandie, on the other hand, was more reminiscent of a modern-day yacht, which could perform rudder repairs without dry docking and could also house a stern anchor, which CGT particularly liked. The Normandie also featured electric motors in synchronization with steam turbines, a practice the US Navy had as a signature for its battleships and aircraft cruisers, letting her move at full speed in reverse and remain at full capacity even if a turbine needed to go down for repairs. Well, the turbo-electric drive was not as efficient at high speeds and was also heavier than other models. It was quieter, which was deemed more comfortable for the passengers, and it was for that reason that it was included in the design, along with many other design improvements, like a far more hydrodynamic hull with a bulb at the front of its bow beneath the waterline. And in practice, everything worked brilliantly. In fact, the design was so well done that it passed scale model testing with flying colors. However, it was far short of the plans that the British had in mind, but the French had an advantage that they weren't even aware of yet. Their economy weathered the Great Depression far better than their competition. Shortly after the financial crash of 1929, White Star dropped out of the naval race, ravaged by the shattered economy. Cunard was still ahead, but the French were making up for lost time, laying down the then unnamed Normandie on January the 26th, 1931. Well, the Depression still hit CGT hard enough for the ship's builders to ask the government for a subsidy to meet the $60 million construction costs. It was a matter of national interest, despite the economic shortcomings. It was around this time that CGT chose the name Normandie. 3 years to the day of the stock market crash felt around the world. Normandie launched on October the 29th, 1932, cheered on by 200,000 spectators. Like her predecessor, the SS Normandie's interior was fully furnished in Art Deco style, which was said to be a strong selling point to passengers, as it was this that was flaunted in promotional material for her maiden voyage in 1935. She was the largest ship afloat at the time, over 70,000 tons in weight and over 1,000 feet in length. She was the fastest ship on the water, designed for 29.5 knots, alternatively 54.6 kilometers per hour or 33.9 miles per hour, but trials recorded a maximum speed of 32.2 knots or 37.1 miles per hour. And perhaps most importantly, she was a floating icon, the epitome of French culture, fitted with the best in fashion and food from the nation of her birth. Her maiden voyage on May the 29th, 1935, had 50,000 people see her off from Le Havre to New York City, setting a record time at 4 days, 3 hours, and 2 minutes. Yorkovich's design secured a smooth and fast journey with a spotless deck for all passengers to enjoy. Speaking of, Normandie had a capacity of 1,972 passengers, with 454 in third class, 607 in tourist, and 848 in first class. These passengers enjoyed the most beautiful ocean liner of the time, perhaps even of all time, As an example, the main dining hall was adorned in bronze and artistic Lolique glass and 38 matching columns and elaborate chandeliers hung at either end. It was longer than the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles and was frequently compared to its beauty. That comparison alone should speak volumes to its extravagance. So it's no wonder the French populace dubbed her the Ship of Lights, just as Paris was the City of Lights. It was also the first ocean liner to ever fit a theater, and the Normandie's theater featured a complete stage. She also had an 80-foot tiled indoor pool, a winter garden featuring live greenery, water features, and cages for exotic birds. Her main lounge was decorated with glass panels and artisan dupas, as well as the largest Aubusson carpet afloat. Every first-class cabin had individualized decor, which resulted in the creation of over 400 different concepts and themes, headed by 2 deluxe apartments on the sun deck. Each of these had 4 bedrooms, a private terrace, servants' quarters, and a private dining salon with a serving area and warming kitchen. It was surprising when a visitor to the Normandie wasn't blown away by her quality and beauty. In fact, some guests found the sheer artistry on display to be overwhelming, reporting headaches from the interior. However, in many ways, Normandie was ahead of her time. The revolutionary design and focus on extravagance, not to mention the price, were too much for common people, who ultimately had a tendency to choose the British Queen Mary over her. Regardless, Normandie still managed to generate profit for CGT despite operating at a time when the politics of Europe were collapsing, something that the British and Dutch could also claim. But unfortunately, it would be that same accolade that brought about the Normandie's downfall. When World War II began, Normandy was in New York Harbor, seeking to escape the growing tensions of the European conflict. 2 days after the German invasion of Poland, the United States federal government interned Normandy in New York Harbor. That same day, France declared war on Germany. Normandie's British rival, Queen Mary, was also seized by the United States and docked next to the French Ship of Lights. While she was in an American port under American jurisdiction, she remained staffed by French crew members and led by a French captain. Soon, they were joined by 150 agents from the Coast Guard. The French staff remained until Pearl Harbor, after which the U.S. Navy commandeered the ship, staffing nearly everything by December the 12th, 1941. Notably, the Navy abandoned the elaborate fire control system on the ship, a mistake they would soon regret. 8 days later, on December the 20th, Normandie's transfer to the U.S. Navy was approved. She was to become a troop transport ship and was renamed the USS Lafayette with the classification AP-53. She was named for the Marquis de Lafayette, a French general who fought for the States during the American Revolution. Interestingly, the Navy considered refitting her into an aircraft carrier, of all things, but it was deemed too much. As the enormous vessel's refit began, deadlines became pressing. The government ordered her to be seaworthy in her conversion by February the 14th, 1942, despite a repeat request of a 2-week extension due to the sheer scale of the task at hand. The captains in charge of the conversion lobbied for clarification of plans to compensate, but before that could occur, disaster struck. At 2:30 p.m. on February the 9th, 1942, a welding torch used by one Clementine Derrick sent sparks that lit a stack of life vests on fire, which was very bad news. You see, due to the rushed nature of the conversion, the flammable woodwork nearby had not yet been removed and caught fire as well. The flame spread rapidly, and since the fire control system had been disconnected, the internal water pump system that would have made quick work of the blaze was inactive. The New York City Fire Department hoses also didn't fit the ship's water inlets. Worse still, a strong wind blew through, fanning the flames and spreading them even further forward, consuming the top 3 decks in an hour. As firefighters began going to work, the ship began to list to port. or tilt to its left side, as the fire hoses pumped onto its starboard side. The ship's designer, Vladimir Yorkovich, was present but barred entry to the site by the harbor police, despite his expertise. His suggestion was to board the ship and flood her lower decks, settling her deeper into the water and stabilizing her enough to continue firefighting without risk of further damage. His suggestion was declined by Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrew, the commander of the naval district they resided in. As time went on, the list worsened. After midnight, the Rear Admiral ordered Lafayette to be abandoned, and by 2:45 a.m. on February the 10th, 1942, she fully capsized, nearly crushing a fireboat in the process. One man died in the disaster, a member of the Fire Watch named Frank Trentacosta. The press was barred from viewing the disaster, as sabotage was suspected, but it was ultimately deemed an accidental fire by mismanagement. The salvage operation was one of the largest and most expensive in history, valued at $94 million in today's money, and could likely be an episode all of its own. The Navy intended to reclassify her as an aircraft and transport ferry and dry dock her in the next month, but the damage was too much, and they deemed her too expensive to repair. And so it was. Lafayette was stricken from the Naval Register on October the 11th, 1945, and sold as scrap almost a year later. And so perhaps seizing this ship was done in vain, as she never sailed under the US flag. Yorkovich tried to cut her down and salvage her as a mid-sized liner, but it failed to draw backing, and she was completely scrapped by New Year's Eve of 1948. Thankfully, not all of the artistry that made Normandie so special was lost to the flames. Many of her pieces are still considered valuable treasures, even today. Door medallions, glass panels, and murals have been rescued and auctioned. The salvage recovered an entire corner of the Grand Saloon, and it can still be viewed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Among the recovered items are thousands of pieces of crystal, silverware, chairs, customized suite furniture, and even a massive bronze sculpture recovered from the New Jersey scrapyard. Normandie remains one of the most beautiful ships ever constructed. Despite only sailing for 4.5 years, she still left an unforgettable mark on the world. In fact, I need to re-emphasize that being compared to the Hall of Mirrors is an honor rarely seen in history, yet she carried that distinction along with being a technological marvel, making her fate all that much more crushing. Perhaps there are some things simply too beautiful to remain in this world for long. Or as they say, the brighter the flame, the sooner it burns out. And perhaps there was no light brighter than the Ship of Lights. And we'll leave it there for today, but thank you all so much for watching. I hope you'll consider subscribing, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.